1 Peter 2:11 says, "Friends, this world is not your home, so don't make yourselves cozy in it. Don't indulge your ego at the expense of your soul." And one thing I love about Peter's letter to these Christians in exile is that he uses this language like they're just passing through. They're exiles, sojourners, pilgrims. Like the idea is he's advocating for a transient life. And he's not just talking about like in some seasons of life, but this is just the way that they're called to live. In fact, it kind of reminds me when my family moved to New Mexico, all 5 of us, my wife and our 3 kids. In the first 6 months that we were in New Mexico, we moved 7 different times. And it was such a wild ride for us because there were weeks and months where we didn't exactly know where we were going to be living next week or next month. And then God just came through and provided, and we kind of just at times felt like gypsies wandering around in the land that we knew God had told us to go to. But it was just this wild ride, and it kind of reminded me of the life of faith, that you just often don't know what's next. You often don't know what is around the next turn. And it reminded me when Paul wrote to the Corinthian church, and he wrote in 2 Corinthians, he says that our bodies are like a tent. And you know, if you think about a tent, the idea is that a tent is not designed for the long term. A tent isn't made, it's not built to stay in it and live in it for a long time. You know, if you've ever been in a tent during a storm, you know it can be kind of miserable. My son and I went camping once, and a rainstorm came on us, and we were cold and wet, and it was noisy. And I felt like at any point the wind may pick up and take the whole tent, and there was lightning and thunder. It was this whole thing. And thankfully we stayed mostly okay, but it was kind of miserable. And that's the whole point of the tent. The tent is a temporary dwelling that you're not meant to stay in for the long haul. And so that's why I love that Paul calls our bodies a tent. Because if you think about it, when he calls our bodies a tent, he's not just pointing to the transient nature, the passing nature of our bodies, but he's reminding us also just of life in general. That life in general, we're just not supposed to get comfortable here on earth. We're just passing through. In fact, if you think about it, being at home in your body on the earth is kind of like setting up your home in a tent in the forest. It's just not meant to be that way. And you know, it's fun for a little while, but that's not where we're meant to stay for the long haul. And so we're just passing through. That's the whole point of life on earth, is here we are and we're on a mission, but this isn't our home. This is why Paul writes about the fact that we are citizens of heaven. So we kind of have dual citizenship. We live here on earth, but our hearts are in heaven. And you know, the sooner we begin to understand that, the better. Because once we understand where our home is, and when we understand that earth and our bodies are not our final resting place, really what it does is it kind of disconnects us a little bit from the world and enables us to live a life with hands wide open, with our hands just open to whatever we have. You know, and I think so often we have this like white knuckle grip on our possessions and our plans, and we've got life figured out, we think. And then something stresses us out, comes around the corner. We didn't see that coming. And it can just stress us out and get us all worked up about whatever it is that we may be facing when things don't seem to be going right. And we have to learn to live with our hands wide open. But it's no wonder that we get so easily worked up like this, because if you think about it, human tendency is to trend toward comfort. Human tendency is to kind of remove pain and pursue pleasure. And I just want to mention, like, the thought of pursuing pleasure, that's not a bad thing. In fact, God wired us for pleasure. The problem is not the feeling of pleasure. The problem is when pleasure owns you and you pursue it with all that you have. And, you know, so God built us for pleasure, and it's not bad to pursue it. The problem is when it begins to take over our minds. And oftentimes when that happens is when we've become too connected to our bodies and our lives here on earth, forgetting where our citizenship really lies. So the good thing is, when you feel like you're a transient, like a gypsy just floating around and you're not sure, you don't feel like you're quite at home, living in this life of tent living, you're in good company. Because Hebrews chapter 11 talks about Abraham. In fact, it says that he was living in the land that God had promised him, but he was living in tents like a foreigner. So this is the land that God said he would inhabit. And yet the crazy thing is that Abraham never owned any of that land except for his own burial plot, where he would one day die, even in the land that God promised him. So if you feel kind of disconnected, if you feel sometimes like you're not at home, just know you're in really good company. And when I read about Abraham in Hebrews 11 and that whole journey, I just wonder, like, how did he endure that lifestyle? How did he endure that transient, just passing through life? Well, it says in Hebrews chapter 11 that he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. So his feet were on earth, but his eyes and his heart were in heaven. And I wonder if we lived that way, how it would change us. Just imagine the mindset shift that would take place if our feet were here on earth, but our eyes and our hearts were in heaven. Imagine how that would impact our relationships. Imagine how that would impact our workplaces, our schools, our homes. Imagine our finances, even most importantly, our priorities. Because when we realize that we're just passing through in this life, everything changes. In fact, the good life really is the just passing through life. That's really the point. Because it's a life of priorities. It's a life not lived for my own pursuit of pleasure, but for God's glory. And so I pray that that would be a life that we live, the life of just passing through. My feet are here on earth, but my heart's in heaven.